Final Fantasy VIII is the 8th, imagine that, game in the Final Fantasy series and was released in Japan on February 11th, 1999 and in North America on September 9th, 1999. It was originally released for the PlayStation 1 and is considered the black sheep of the series. That's not to say it doesn't have its fans, but the fandom is practically split down the center with this installment. People either absolutely love it, or they absolutely hate it. On December 5th, 2013, Final Fantasy VIII was brought to the PC platform when it was uploaded to Steam. However, the version that I will be reviewing today is the HD remaster that was released on Steam just last year on September 3rd, 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Final Fantasy VIII Retrospective. As I just mentioned a moment ago, this is an HD remaster of the original game. As such, we naturally expect the graphics in this game to be, well, HD. Unfortunately, this remastering of the game is clearly just doing the bare minimum so that it can technically call itself HD. Yes, the character models look better than they did on the original hardware, but you really have to put the two side by side in order to notice. By 2019 standards, these graphics are honestly a disappointment. I would consider these graphics to be on par with the 7th generation of consoles and early to mid 7th gen at that, not the early 9th generation like we're currently in. In fact, just to give you an idea of just how lazy this HD remaster is, consider this. There is no 16:9 aspect ratio in this game. Technically the option is there. There is the option to play this game in 1280 by 720 or 1920 by 1080 resolution. However, the game still only renders itself in 4:3. The only difference is that the game window now moves from the left side of the screen to the center. That's honestly about it. Honestly, if you're not going to give me the option to play the game in 16:9, why have the option be present in the first place? It's just like Final Fantasy II on the PS1 and its 3D cutscenes. If you just want to make a 4:3 game, just make a 4:3 game, but don't tease me with the promise of 16:9 if you're not gonna deliver the goods. It's not even like updating this game for 16:9 resolution would even be that difficult. In 99% of the game, it would have been a simple matter of taking the camera's field of view and making it bigger. For the overworld, it would simply be a matter of showing more of the overworld on screen at once. Indoors, it would mean that the CCTV camera would have to do less panning back and forth because it would be showing more of the interior cell at one time. The only time I can think of when this wouldn't be just a simple matter of expanding the camera's field of view is during the game's battles. The camera is usually in a fixed location during battles, so the original game developers might not have developed graphics beyond the 4:3 margins. So instead of just giving an HD spit shine to the old graphics, the developers for the remastered version would have to create entirely new graphics from the ground up. Then again, maybe not. Because of this game's junctioning and leveling system, more on that later, I ended up using summons a lot more often than I did in earlier Final Fantasy games. These guys' attack animations are shown from a wide variety of different camera angles, so obviously background footage would have to have been designed with these alternative camera angles in mind. In fact, the summons attack animations are one of the few parts of this game's graphics that I actually kind of enjoy. They are easily the most visually exciting things to happen during battles, and since they are, especially for novices to this game, the most powerful attacks in the early to mid-game, you're going to be seeing them quite a lot. To show you just how far the summons attack animations have come, take a look at the Leviathan attack animation in Final Fantasy IV. Fucking riveting, isn't it? Now let's take a look at the Leviathan attack animation in Final Fantasy VIII. Wow, that was actually quite impressive. Now, these attack animations are indeed quite lengthy, but they're not so excessively long that I have to dock points from this game just on their length alone, like I did the Supernova attack in Final Fantasy VII. However, overall, this HD remaster of the game just feels lazy. It really feels like they only did the bare minimum to be able to call this an HD remaster. Compare that to the remake of Final Fantasy VII that came out just a few months after this game. Put it side by side with the PS1 version of this game and the difference is night and day. Now, I totally understand why this game's remaster would not be given nearly the same budget as 7's remake. Not only is 8 the black sheep of the series, but 7 is one of the most popular games in the entire franchise. Even those who don't self-identify as Final Fantasy fans still have played, or at the very least know about, 7. However, even considering that, I still think the remaster is completely half-assed. This wasn't the big rigs over-the-road racing of Final Fantasy games where attempting to polish a turd would be seen as a complete waste of resources. This game does have its fans. It's just a heavily polarizing game. Besides, it's not my job as a critic to throw the developers a bone if they didn't have a very big budget or comfortable development cycle. I got a comment like that recently on my Fallout New Vegas retrospective, where they argue that this game was a great game when you consider the fact that they only made it in 18 months. I fired back at that comment by pointing out that, by that logic, E.T. for the Atari 2600 is also a great game. After all, the developer Howard Scott Warshaw had a measly 5 weeks to make that game, so the fact that he was able to make anything playable at all is a damn miracle. And yet, nobody cuts that game any slack. The reason for that is obvious. Put simply and plainly, it is not the reviewer's job to throw the developers a bone because of any technical, political, financial, or any other type of problems they may have experienced during development. It is only a reviewer's job to judge the game as is. And what's here, at least as far as the HD remaster is concerned, is really underwhelming. I mean, at the very least, couldn't you have given this game some voice acting? By 2019, voice acting is part the course for everything except super low-budget indie titles. Instead, dialogue in this game is communicated exclusively through text boxes, which just makes this HD remaster, released just barely a year ago, feel ridiculously archaic. Honestly, in regards to this game's audio, this is one of the few times when Uematsu's music left me feeling rather bleh. There's certainly no breakout smash hit like the X-Death theme from Final Fantasy V or the Cosmic Canyon theme from Final Fantasy VII, but nor is there anything truly terrible like the Temple of the Ancients theme in Final Fantasy V either. It's mostly just mediocrity across the board. Compared to 7, the victory music is certainly improved, but that's not exactly a high bar to clear. While it keeps the same opening riff, 8 at least pairs that opening riff with some music that is similarly upbeat, so the victory music doesn't suffer from quite as much tonal whiplash as in 7. However, improving upon absolute trash is not exactly an accomplishment worth bragging about. Now, there's one last thing I need to talk about when it comes to this music. This time it has nothing to do with Uematsu being a shit composer, although for the record I would like to reiterate that he is in fact a shit composer. Rather, it's what happens to the music whenever I pause the game. Sometimes the music stops whenever I pause the game. But sometimes it keeps going. Okay, first of all, the music should never continue to play whenever you pause the game. What if you have a phone call or someone comes knocking? You need the game to go quiet when this happens. But why would you make the music stop during pause sometimes, but not other times? If the music just didn't stop at all when you paused, at least you could chalk that up to the game developers forgetting to program in the stopping of the music. But here, you don't have that excuse. In some cases, you stopped the music, but in other cases, you made a conscious choice to let the music keep playing, and that's just fucked up. Overall, this game's aesthetic presentation is just a big disappointment. They really only did the bare minimum to call this an HD remaster, and they failed to make quite a few updates that were expected in the modern times. One improvement this game certainly has over its original counterpart is how various cheat codes are built into the game by default. This isn't something that was added in the HD remaster, it was already in the original 2013 port of this game as well, but it effectively does many of the things I've been using Game Genie or Game Shark codes to do in older games. Max level, infinite money, no random encounters, etc, etc. Words cannot express how much I appreciate these cheats. Not just having them in the game at all, but the fact that Square doesn't charge us microtransactions every time we want to use them. Square Enix shows the rest of the game industry how it's done. Especially nowadays, game developers are making their games boring and grindy as hell just so they can sell you time-saver microtransactions. As Jim Sterling once said in his impressions video of Ghost Recon Breakpoint,
if a game sells you time savers, it's admitting it's a bad game. Because it's admitting that there's a monetary value on playing the game less.
You want to give us some time savers in order to give us the option to skip the grind? Awesome! That sounds like a great idea! Make it part of the base game and don't charge us extra for it. Most of us wouldn't even mind the time savers if we didn't have to pay extra for them. That, however, is the only real compliment I plan to pay this game in the gameplay department. This time around, the name of the game is Confusion. This game seems intentionally designed so that you have to get a guide in order to know what to do. I'd like to go down the list and discuss just a few of the instances where I felt like this game was intentionally made cryptic or otherwise bullshitty. Bear in mind that these are just the highlights, not an exclusive list. Are you ready? Okay, here we go. Early in the game, we get a mission to go to the city of Timber. Only problem is, it's on another continent than we're currently on, and we don't yet have a boat or airship. The game gives you absolutely no hints about how you're supposed to get there, so what do? Well, according to an online guide, you're supposed to take a train. Yeah, apparently trains can cross oceans in this universe. Not that that's ever been explained or even implied at any point in this game prior to this. You're supposed to somehow just know that you're supposed to take a train. Now, if a city were on the other side of an otherwise impassable mountain range, and I could see a railroad passing through that mountain, then I would have probably noticed on my own that I'm supposed to take a train. But how am I supposed to know to do that when trains don't even cross oceans in real life at all? Later, I go to a place called Delling City in order to meet up with a client. Once I get to Delling City, however, where this guy lives is entirely up to me to find out. You can spend a half an hour combing the entire city from top to bottom, and you can very easily not find this guy's house. Jesus Christ, couldn't this client have left us an address or something? Or better yet, couldn't the fucking game designers have given us directions on how to get to his house? When we finally meet up with this guy, whose name is Caraway, we're given plans on how to assassinate the sorceress Edea. Once we have our plans and it comes time to actually do the assassination mission, actually triggering the appropriate cutscenes is a puzzle in and of itself. If you go to the spot you're supposed to be, nothing really happens. Instead, we're supposed to talk to Caraway a second time just to trigger the events. Why? Caraway doesn't say anything of importance the second time. Why can't we just go to the spot where we're supposed to be? Why do we need this random and arbitrary starter pistol? There are quite a few moments in this game where you have to talk to everyone who is on screen at the moment in order to make the plot advance, even if these characters have nothing meaningful to say. Often the stuff that these characters say is just generic stuff like, "I'm scared," or "This is exciting." You know, the kind of stuff where the characters don't really have anything at all to say, but if they had literally no dialogue, the game would probably freeze because it's trying to load a dialogue box that doesn't exist. So developers give the characters something, anything, to say just in case the player talks to them, just to prevent the game from freezing and possibly breaking your console. Well, this dialogue honestly feels like that, except that talking to these characters is mandatory to advance the plot. Why? Why can't the trigger for the next cutscene be something that actually feels organic to do? During the aforementioned assassination mission, the B Squad is traversing through the sewers. These sewers are a fucking maze, and actually figuring out which directions you're supposed to go is mostly trial and error. This dungeon doesn't give you many landmarks either to help you keep track of where you've been. Every place looks almost exactly the same, so I'm basically just running around like a chicken with my head cut off until finally by some miracle I manage to find my way out. Don't ask me how. Later, we're exploring the basement and engine room of Balam Garden. We come across this ladder, so naturally it is reasonable to assume we're supposed to climb it. We go up there, find ourselves in some upper room, and do something on the controls. We hear a sound effect, and we assume something must have happened. But what exactly happened is for the player to figure out. We're supposed to just know that this gate is now unlocked. How are we supposed to know that? There is a ladder underneath the gate, but it's not clearly visible and it's very easy to miss. I thought these vertical bars here were just there to provide pillar support for the rest of the guardrail. I can only imagine how cryptic this would have been on the original hardware, where the graphics were much more pixelated than they are here. Honestly, it would have been far less headache-inducing if flipping this switch had opened this gate rather than simply unlocked it. That would have been much easier for me to notice. Later, Balam Garden is in a battle against the Galbadian Garden. At numerous points in this battle, you're supposed to go to one specific location to advance the plot, but fuck me if the game actually tells you where to go, or if the place you're supposed to go actually makes sense in context, or feels the least bit organic. However, the one moment in this battle that really takes the gold in the "how the fuck was I supposed to know to do this" competition has to be immediately after Squall hears that Rinoa is hanging on for dear life. So he runs off to find something long enough to reach down to her so she can grab on and he can pull her to safety. You know where you're supposed to go to trigger the next cutscene? To the classroom where you began the game. How the fuck did Squall expect to find anything he could save Rinoa's life with in there? What, am I supposed to assume that because this is the classroom where Quistis used to teach, and because Quistis uses a whip as her weapon of choice, that maybe she might have a few chains or leather straps stored away somewhere in this classroom? Later in the game, we need to go to the city of Esthar. But of course, while the game tells us to go to Esthar, it doesn't mark Esthar on our map for us, like it has done for every other city in the game up to this point. But even when I check an online map and find out that Esthar is located right here, I can't just sail up to Esthar like I can any other city. Because we don't have an airship yet, we can't fly, so if we're on water, we can only go onto dry land if there's a beach with a low incline. If there's a plateau, we just run up against it. Well, I actually sailed around the entire circumference of this continent, and there is not a single beach where we can bring our base onto dry land. You know how we get to Esthar? We have to sail around to the other continent on the east, the one that has timber in it, loop around this giant bridge that is suddenly here for no conceivable reason, sail up to an island city called Fisherman's Horizon, and then take the train over to the eastern continent that has Esthar on it. Why didn't the game just tell us to go to Fisherman's Horizon if we're supposed to go to Fisherman's Horizon? And last but not least, sometimes when you're talking to an NPC, the game will spontaneously end the conversation. But of course, that doesn't mean the conversation is over. You regain control of Squall, but you can't go anywhere or do anything else without being reprimanded. The only thing you can do is talk to the very same NPC you just talked to in order to resume the conversation. What? Why can't you just make it one continuous conversation? This happens numerous times in this game and it makes absolutely no sense. Jesus Christ, Katase, do you think a little sense of direction would have killed this game? The only way this game could have been more dependent on online guides is if progressing through the game required you enter a password at various intervals, and nowhere in the game does it ever say what the password is. Now, you would think, with a game this cryptic, where you often have to just know what you're supposed to do, this game would be rather forgiving if you go the wrong way from time to time. But no, more than any other game I have ever played, not just in Final Fantasy, this game punishes you for going even slightly off the beaten path. The way it achieves this is through its seed ranking system. Since Seed is the name of the organization you're a mercenary for hire for, how much money you get at the end of each mission is dependent on what your Seed rank is. You gain a higher Seed rank by following orders to the letter, not dallying, and doing your duties diligently and without delay. However, this also means that you lose points in your Seed rank and therefore make less money by delaying in the discharge of your duties. This is one of the most annoying game mechanics I have ever played, because it means that if you do not do exactly what the game wants you to do, if you even so much as veer ever so slightly to the left in a fucking linear corridor, a message will pop up telling you that you've lost points to your Seed score. It would be bad enough if you just made less money in the game, but what makes this absolutely insufferable is how the game constantly nags you as soon as you go even slightly off the beaten path. If I even so much as veer slightly off course, nag. Jesus, it's like having my fucking in-laws over for dinner. Here is just one example of just how bullshitty this mechanic can get. Selphie tells us that she'll meet us over at the basketball court. We head over to the basketball court, and what next? Well, so far in this game, I've managed to make the story progress by talking to everyone on screen at the moment. So I head over to the left in order to start talking to Irvine and Christus, and I lose Seed points. Why? Well, as it turns out, what I was really supposed to do to trigger the next cutscene is actually go back out the way I came, and I would meet Selphie at the door on the way out. Because of course that's what I'm supposed to do. I was told to meet Selphie at the basketball court, so obviously the most logical course of action is to leave the basketball court. It seems so obvious in hindsight, not counterproductive to my goals in the slightest. Ugh. So because I didn't do the thing that made absolutely no sense, but which I was supposed to magically know to do because fuck you, and because I instead did the thing the game has conditioned me up to this point to do, I ended up losing Seed points. For fuck's sake, Katase, just let me play the damn game on my own terms. Let me go off the beaten path. Let me explore to see if there's any goodies around the next corner. Let me take chances, make mistakes, get messy. At the very least, have the Seed rank be an almost entirely under the hood mechanic that only affects how much money I'm getting. There is no need to constantly nag me over every single misstep I take like you're my goddamned in-laws. So I've talked about the gameplay, now let's talk about the controls. First of all, the CCTV camera system from Final Fantasy VII is back, as is the ability to rotate the camera on the overworld using the L1 and R1 buttons. However, they have also added an auto-adjust to the overworld camera. Remember what I said last time about how auto-adjusting cameras back in the 5th and 6th generation of consoles had a tendency to be a gameplay hazard more dangerous than the actual in-game enemies? Well, that problem rears its ugly head here. This camera just seems to point wherever the fuck it wants. If I'm holding down either the L1 or R1 buttons, the camera will rotate according to my input, but as soon as I release the shoulder buttons, the game goes right back to auto-adjusting the camera in the most annoying way possible. This would be bad enough on the original hardware because Final Fantasy VII already had a perfectly functional overworld camera system, one that didn't auto-adjust at all, but instead only adjusted if you used the shoulder buttons to rotate it. So why would you take 2 steps back for this game when you already had a functional camera system? But even if that weren't the case, this version of the game was released in 2019, when these sorts of wrinkles should have long since been ironed out. So this annoying-ass camera system is doubly inexcusable. Then there's the driving controls. There's one point in the game where you have to use a car. After that, all car rentals are optional. However, the controls on this car is abysmal. Basically, you tilt left and right on the D-stick to pivot on a dime, the left face button to move forward, the right face button to move in reverse, and the bottom face button to get out of the car. The problem is, as you can see from this footage, I can't stay in my lane to save my life. This is also the same control scheme we use when driving the Balam Garden and the Ragnarok, the game's airship. Why do you have to change the controls? Are you trying to make the controls feel like an actual car for the sake of immersion, so you map the gas pedal to a button instead of pressing up on the D-pad to move forward? Because as you can clearly see, it does not control at all like a real car, it controls like shit! In the 2D Final Fantasy games, the controls when you were riding a Chocobo, sailing the boat, and flying the airship were all the same as the controls when you were on foot, which is to say you press a direction on the D-pad and you move in that direction. That was immersive. That was intuitive. You know why it was so immersive? Because I didn't have to think about getting the vehicle to do what I needed it to do. It just does what I want it to do. The controller was just an extension of my mind. It's practically subconscious. Having to remind myself which button to press in order to get my character to do X, Y, or Z is much more devastating to my sense of immersion than the actual steps of a process being unrealistic. So to any game developers who might be watching this review, I want you all to keep this in mind. Making something more realistic for its own sake is a bullshit philosophy of game design. Like Final Fantasy VII, this game tries to use some mini-games to break up the monotonous gameplay. But unlike Final Fantasy VII, none of these mini-games are particularly good. Final Fantasy VIII tries for a quality over quantity approach compared to VII, but the problem with this philosophy is that quality is subjective. VII had a lot of mini-games. Some of them were quite aggravating, while some of them were quite interesting indeed. And one of them was freaking awesome. The large quantity of minigames allowed VII to appeal to a wide variety of tastes. Much like the playable characters in Final Fantasy VI, having a large quantity of mini-games ensured that as many players as possible would have at least 1 or 2 mini-games they enjoyed. Final Fantasy VIII does not take that approach. I only came across about a half a dozen mini-games during my playthrough, and they were all quite mediocre. The biggest minigame this game has to offer is the Triple Triad minigame. Basically, walk up to anybody on foot, press the left face button, and you can play Triple Triad against them. This is basically a bog standard card game. There's a card for just about every main character and every monster in the game. There's a 3x3 grid you can place cards on, and each card has 4 numbers on it, ranging from 1 through 10, with 10 being represented by the letter A. Basically, one guy puts his card down, then another person puts their card down. If you place a card next to another card, the corresponding numbers are compared, and if the card you place has a number that's higher than the other card, you get control of that other card. At the end, once all 9 spots have been used up, whoever has control over the most cards wins. Somehow it's possible to draw in this game even though there's an odd number of spaces, and so tying should be impossible. Honestly, I find this game rather boring. There's no real strategy to this game. It's over in about a minute anyway, so there's no real opportunity to strategize. It's basically a game of high number. It honestly feels like the Final Fantasy equivalent of Candy Crush. Something that doesn't require a whole lot of skill or deep thought, but which is basically just there to give your fingers something to do to pass the time while you expel shit out your anus. You have to understand, this is the biggest and most prominent minigame in the entire game. Nearly every NPC plays Triple Triad, and the few who don't usually have some excuse why they don't, e.g. his wife just doesn't want him doing it. Hey, I said they usually have an excuse, I didn't say it was a very good excuse. So when this game's primary minigame ends up being quite mediocre, that really sets the tone for the rest of the minigames this game has to offer. When we head over to Timber, there's a minigame where you have to enter the combination to unlock a door so we can separate the train cars. There are only 4 numbers on the safe, which correspond to the 4 face buttons on the controller. First of all, why only 4? I get this game was originally designed for the PS1, which didn't have analog sticks as a standard feature on the controllers, but even then, the PS1 controller still had 4 shoulder buttons and 4 face buttons, providing a total of 8 buttons we could have used to input this code. However, that's not what really kills this minigame. What really kills it is the fact that you are told the combination immediately before you have to enter it, and you are not given nearly enough time to read and memorize the combination. I actually timed it. The text dialogue stays on screen for a grand total of 2/3 of a second before it disappears. Now, after I finished this minigame, I remembered that I actually used the booster that causes this game to move at 3 times the normal speed. So I am aware of the possibility that the time I had to memorize the combination might also have been sped up. But even if that were the case, that still means I would only get a measly 2 seconds to read and memorize the code at normal speed. Then they try to give us a sense of urgency by stating that we're on a strict time limit and that if we fuck this up, the resistance is over. I made sure to save at the save point before I began this minigame because of that. But no, you actually get unlimited tries to get this right, and each time you fail, you get more and more time added to the clock. So there's really no pressure at all. Early on in Disc 2, we escape from a prison. At one point, there's an event where the prison is trying to submerge itself underground, and Squall ends up hanging on for dear life. The first time I did this minigame, I actually failed and got an immediate game over because I didn't even realize that this was even a minigame. So, when I got back to that spot, you know how you win this minigame? Hold right on the D-pad. That's literally it. That's literally all you need to do. You made an entire minigame out of that? What's next? Are you gonna make an entire minigame out of cutting a fart? Later, when we do the Battle of the Gardens, there's a minigame where one enemy soldier in a hang glider gets into a fist fight with us. There are 3 buttons we can press, 1 to punch, 1 to kick, and 1 to block his attacks. Now, at first glance, this seems like an interesting minigame. Unlike the aforementioned hanging from the ledge minigame, where all you have to do is press right to win, this minigame actually seems like it would require some minuscule amount of strategy or reflexes. Unfortunately, all of that goes away when you consider how the death blows work. Basically, this allows you to shave off about half your enemy's health with 1 hit, and there's really no skill whatsoever to using them. You're basically holding down the block button, block about 3 or 4 attacks, and then the option appears on screen to do a death blow. There's no skill, no timing, no reflexes, no nothing to using this technique, and you can defeat this guy with only 2 death blows. They really should have kept it to just punching, kicking, and blocking. Then it would have actually required some skill to win. But I'll take this version of the minigame any day of the week over the second time this minigame comes up. We take control of a guy called Laguna, more on him later, who has taken up acting to make some money. He's supposed to have a staged fight with a fake dragon, only to instead get into a real fight with a real dragon. This time, we only have two options, attack and block, and there are no death blows this time around. Now, you would think that, given how much I just got finished criticizing the death blows, I would be happy to see them gone. However, this version of the minigame also decided to add in a delay to your controls. In the footage you're seeing right now, it looks like I'm only activating my block just as the dragon is lunging his attack at me, but I'm actually pressing the button to block as soon as I finish attacking the dragon. It's only the game that takes 80,000 years to register the button press and actually block for me. Quite frankly, I'm reminded of something the angry video game nerd once said in his review of the Simpsons games.
Now, I don't have a problem with challenge, but when the challenge is based on how fucking crippled the controls are, then fuck it!
Just like with the first version of this minigame, the quickest and easiest way to win this minigame is also the least strategic and least skillful. For the longest time, I thought I had to go back and forth with the dragon, waiting for my moment to strike, and then seizing that opportunity. But instead, all I'm really supposed to do is block once, and then attack the dragon again and again. When I attack him, he gets staggered for a little bit. This gives me a narrow window of opportunity to attack him again. And again. And again. Stagger locking him. He goes down remarkably quickly when you figure this out. However, this takes literally all the skill out of this minigame. There's no technique, no strategy, no timing, no reflexes, no fucking thought whatsoever. Just flail your arms around like a jackass. Hell, even Skyrim at least required you to learn the recipe for vegetable soup before you could stagger lock your enemies like this. The last minigame I played during this playthrough happens out in space. A character named Rinoa has just been jettisoned into space, and so Squall goes to rescue her. Once again, there is no skill to this minigame beyond what would be expected of literal babies. All you have to do is keep Rinoa's spacesuit in the center of your screen. You do this by using the D-pad to adjust your first-person camera view in the same way you would use the right thumbstick to adjust your camera view in a traditional first-person game. And Squall will automatically float towards wherever he's facing. This might have been a novel concept back in 1999 when this game was first released. After all, as I've said numerous times already, dual analog sticks weren't a standard feature of controllers in the 5th generation of consoles. But nowadays, it seems like the equivalent of making a minigame out of figuring out where the pause button is, in terms of how much this has become a bog standard part of gaming controls. So overall, the mini-games in this game are a downgrade across the board from Final Fantasy VII. Not only are there fewer mini-games this time around, but the few mini-games they do have are quite boring, which completely defeats the whole point of having fewer mini-games in the first place. The only one that requires any strategy or skill beyond what would be expected of preschoolers is Triple Triad, and even that's just mediocre. Okay, let me get my one compliment per section out of the way. Remember in my Final Fantasy VII Retrospective where I said that limit breaks should be something you could store up rather than replacing your regular attack? Well, we have that here. Now whenever you get a limit break, you use it by moving over to the regular attack option on your attack menu and then pressing right to show the limit breaks. This means that you no longer have to hold off on regular attacks if you're saving your limit break for the upcoming boss fight. You can just save it. So I definitely appreciate that quality of life improvement. Much like in The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion and The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, enemies in this game scale to your level. However, unlike in the Elder Scrolls games, there is a way you can get a huge advantage over enemies, and that's by having high-level Guardian Forces. Guardian Forces, or GFs for short, are this game's summons, but they serve more than just summon spells. You junction your GFs to your character and they boost your stats. Because the enemies are not scaled to your GF's level, that means you can gain a huge advantage in combat by keeping your character's levels low while keep maxing out the strength of your GFs. There is just one problem with this whole system. The junctioning system is an overly complicated, headache-inducing mechanic. I have played through the whole game and I still don't quite understand just how this works. I honestly prefer to simply auto-junction my characters. I can't even tell you how junctioning works because I literally don't understand it. So my opinion on whether the junctioning system is good or bad is, I don't fucking understand the junctioning system in the slightest! Honestly, this junctioning system was not necessary. I can understand Katase wanting to keep things nice and fresh, to keep things innovative. You can only make so many annual Call of Duty games before they all blur together. But at the same time, innovation for innovation's sake often does more harm than good. Look at Star Fox Zero as a prime example. That was a game where Miyamoto insisted on doing something to innovate the Star Fox franchise, and the result was a clunky, uncontrollable mess that could have been avoided if Miyamoto had simply made a simple Star Fox game. Frankly, the action time battle system from Final Fantasy IV through VII worked just fine. I honestly prefer the turn-based battle system from Super Mario RPG, but the ATB system of 4 through 7 certainly ironed out many of the issues I complained about in the combat system of the first 3 games. There honestly was no need to reinvent the wheel so radically when the wheel was already perfectly functional. Anytime you have an idea for a new game mechanic, you should always ask yourself, how does this make the game more fun to play? Don't just simply put the game mechanic in there and assume the end result will somehow match the grand vision you have in your head. By tying your character's progression entirely to the junctioning system, you make quite a few other mechanics in the game completely redundant. For example, characters no longer get new weapons in this game. Since the primary source of character progression in these games is through the junctioning system, there's no need to have a weapon progression system. You can upgrade your weapons, but not get newer, more powerful ones. All the weapon upgrades are available at the first shop in the game, so your only limitation on getting the highest quality weapons for your character early in the game is how much money you have saved up. In addition, because of the way enemies scale to your level, you are incentivized to keep your characters at a low level, meaning their regular attacks are much weaker than their GF attacks. So you are incentivized to not use your regular attacks. In addition, you can also junction your spells to your stats as well, getting bonuses based on those stats. The more of each spell you have, the higher the stat bonus. However, notice what I just said there. Instead of having a mana pool, which you draw from every time you cast a spell, you now have multiple copies of each spell. First of all, this makes your spells completely redundant of the items that do the same thing. Now, the life spell is basically just a Phoenix Down, but listed under a different category. Second, because the number of each spell you have dictates how much of a stat boost you receive, that means you are encouraged not to use your spells, because each one you use will subsequently make you weaker. So because you are encouraged not to use your regular attacks or your spells, that basically means you are reduced to spamming your GF attacks for the majority of the game. So overall, the junctioning system is a complete dumpster fire from top to bottom. It is a clunky and confusing game mechanic that, at best, adds an unnecessary layer of complexity and accessibility barriers onto a system that was already fine, and at worst actively takes value away from the game because it encourages you not to use half the tools at your disposal during battle. What a waste of programming! The main characters in this game are criminally underdeveloped. The vast majority of them end the game with the exact same personalities they were introduced with. Irving is a sharpshooter who is also a bit of a loner. His only real character traits are A, he's a loner who puts all of his existence into his sniper shot, and because sharpshooters tend to work alone, that means he doesn't have any friends. And B, whenever he gets ready to fire a shot, he always gets nervous and clams up. That's it. That's literally the extent of his character. He never undergoes any real character arc throughout the game. The closest he gets to character development is in the cutscene where he admits to getting nervous when he gets ready to shoot. Squall suggests he think of his shooting not as an assassination in its own right, but just as a starter pistol, a signal for the rest of them to jump in. Maybe you could call that character development, but for reasons I'll go into more detail on when I talk about the story, there may even be other reasons why he's nervous about shooting in the first place. Zell is a hyperactive ball of energy, and while he's certainly likable enough, he never really evolves from his hyperactive behavior he's introduced as. There's an optional side quest where he can get himself a girlfriend, but that's about it. He doesn't really evolve his character. Heck, even then, he and the girl mostly just make googly eyes at each other. They never actually get together. At the very least, the story is rather ambiguous about their relationship. Selphie likes fast cars. That's it. That's the beginning and end of her personality. Hell, even then, her personality is only really on display in literally one scene in the entire game. And that's when she first sits in the cockpit of the airship, having the time of her life. That is literally the only time her personality actually gets shown to us. Beyond that, she's a complete blank slate. There was at least one section in the game when she honestly should have gotten some character development, but instead, the game for some reason decided to give the focus to a different character. Rajan is a character who only appears in the story once in a while, and his entire shtick is that he tacks the phrase "you know" at the end of every sentence he says. That's it. That's literally his entire character. He's literally just the "you know" guy. Newsflash, Katase, giving someone a personality requires more than just giving them a catchphrase. Anyway, there's also another trio of characters who we follow on and off called Laguna, Kios, and Ward. Kios and Ward are both even bigger blank slates than Selphie is. Laguna sort of gets some character development, but it's not much. It mostly boils down to getting saved by some people in a city known as Windhill and developing paternal affections for a girl called Elone. We get bits and pieces of Laguna's life, but the game skips around, so we can't really get to know Laguna because we don't really follow him in a very cohesive manner. The reason we follow him from time to time is because our characters pass out at random intervals, and we suddenly start following these characters. When the main characters wake up from their dreams, they all recall having the same dream, so we know they're real. We eventually find out that it's Elone herself who is causing us to have these visions. She can cause people she knows in the present to enter the memories of those she used to know in the past. Okay, first of all, the origin of these powers is never explained. She can somehow just do this. And that's just lazy. How is she able to do this? Because plot convenience, god damn it! Even Final Fantasy VI, with all of its narrative problems, still gave us an explanation as to how Terra was able to use magic unaided. With Elone's power, we get fuck all. But even barring that, Elone's power has a rather strange combination of rules. She can only send people into comas if she knows them in the present, and she can only send them into the memories of people she used to know, not those she currently knows. So does that mean she doesn't know Laguna anymore? How do you unmeet a person? Also, what does it mean to know a person? When we first meet the adult version of Elone, Squall has to confirm if she's actually alone. This means that Squall doesn't know Elone, and yet Elone knows him? Meanwhile, when Squall demands that Elone send him into Rinoa's past so he can change the past, Elone says that she can't do that because she's never met Rinoa before. Literally a few minutes later, she has seen Rinoa walking by in a zombie-like trance, and that apparently is good enough for Elone to be able to oblige Squall's request. So she didn't know Rinoa at first, then knew her, and then suddenly unknew her, however the fuck that works, all in the span of a few minutes. So does knowing someone mean you don't have to be in their social circle? You just need to know who they are? I've never met Donald Trump, but I still know who he is. If I had Elone's power, could I send him into a comatose state whenever I wanted and completely fuck up the rest of his presidency by keeping him from discharging his duties as president? Honestly, this power of Elone's makes no sense. On top of that, Elone is a complete and total bitch. What exactly is she hoping to accomplish by sending Squall and friends into these comas? She said she needed to know something about Laguna, but she never states what exactly that was. We, the audience, sure as fuck never learn anything about Laguna. For that matter, the last memory of Laguna's she sends us into is one of him rescuing her from her prison. So why does she need to see Laguna's memories for that? Shouldn't she already have memories of that herself? What exactly was she hoping to find out about Laguna by kidnapping your brain and sending it into the past like that? And yes, I called it a kidnapping, because when Squall finds out that it is Elone who is doing this, he states in no uncertain terms that he does not want her to do this to him. He has enough on his plate trying to figure out how to defeat Edea and later Ultimecia, and he doesn't need any added drama from a teenage girl and her daddy issues. Despite this, Elone still continues to send Squall and friends into the memories of Laguna, Kios, and Ward against their will and at completely random moments. This woman is a complete bitch who is completely inconsiderate of anyone else's feelings. So that just leaves Squall and Rinoa, who admittedly have the bulk of character development in this game, although that's not really a high bar to clear. Rinoa's primary personality trait is her determination to do whatever it takes to stop the bad guy. She explains that she hates fighting, but at the same time she demands that she be given the chance to fight, simply because she understands that that's what needs to be done. Squall is a bottled up case. He likes to keep to himself and not talk about his feelings a lot. When Quistis is telling him about losing her job, Squall is completely out of his element, not knowing how to approach a conversation like this because talking about his feelings is practically a foreign concept to him. We eventually learn that the reason he's like this is because he fears rejection, and so he believes the less people know about him, the less they'll have to judge him for. These two character traits and their personalities would certainly be quite compelling, were it not for the game's refusal, not inability, but refusal to convey these personalities through anything other than dry exposition and dialogue. For example, in the case of Rinoa's dislike of violence, we never see her act squeamish at the prospect of violence, nor do we ever see her try to talk any of the characters out of a violent response. Instead, she just tells us that she doesn't like violence. Squall's reluctance to open up emotionally is not something you can easily show except during conversation, so I'm willing to forgive that one. But then, his reason for why he's so bottled up, his fear of rejection, could have been shown in so many other, more interesting ways than just an internal monologue. And yet Kitase went with the most boring way possible to convey that character trait. A moment ago I said that this storytelling pitfall wasn't because game director Yoshinori Kitase didn't know how to show rather than tell, but because he just didn't want to show rather than tell, and I stand by that. Bear in mind that Kitase also directed Final Fantasy VII, and while I have quite a few problems with that game's story and character arcs, the way the characters' personalities and character development are presented to us is not one of them. But even in this game, there is at least one main character whose personality the game shows to us rather than simply tells us about, and that character is Zell. As I mentioned earlier, Zell is a hyperactive goofball. Except that the game doesn't just tell us that he's a hyperactive goofball. Sure, when we first meet him, Squall mentions how he's loud and annoying, but immediately after that, we see, rather than read about, Zell doing cartwheels and backflips just because why not? Later, we see him bouncing on the train's couch because he likes how soft and spongy it feels. Later, we see him rallying the troops for battle and making heavily exaggerated arm movements. Clearly, Kitase and his team know how to show don't tell when it comes to their main characters' personalities, so his failure to do so with Squall and Rinoa, the two characters he's actually wanting to give the most development to, is a conscious choice on his part. Speaking of which, Squall and Rinoa's character development primarily comes not in how the characters themselves grow or change, but in the romance that develops between them. With Zell and his potential girlfriend, it's more of a will they won't they kind of thing. We never see them actually hook up. But with Squall and Rinoa, it's much more explicit. They're falling in love and there's no two ways about it. This serves as the primary character development in this game, while all the other characters get pushed to the wayside. Much like the mini-games, Kitase really went for quality over quantity when it comes to character development, and like the mini-games, I think the game falls flat on its face because of it. Now, don't get me wrong, normally I am all for quality over quantity in your character arcs, but in order for that to work, the few character arcs you provide need to be good. For a romance plot to be good, the characters involved need to have good chemistry. I honestly hate that word, chemistry, because that's also the name of a science, and naming it after a science implies that it's much more objective and predictable than it actually is. In actual chemistry, if you combine 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, what do you get? If you answer anything other than water, you're just plain wrong. But when you're talking about romance between 2 fictional characters, chemistry becomes an almost entirely subjective term. However, until a better word is coined for this context, that is the term I am stuck with. And in my entirely subjective opinion, Squall and Rinoa have no chemistry, or at the very least very poor chemistry. However, one thing I can comment on regarding this romance that goes beyond the purely subjective discussion of how good their chemistry is how the romance is actually built up. Squall actually spends half the game almost completely indifferent to this romance. For example, in the aforementioned set piece where Rinoa is hanging on for dear life, Squall never really makes any attempt to save her life. He then tells his friends that he did what he could, even though he didn't. He didn't even try. It's clear he didn't even care. It's the rest of the main cast who guilt trips him into saving Rinoa. When he does rescue her, he even points out that the other characters are trying to hook the two of them up, and he is utterly annoyed by their constant attempts at getting him laid. Look, I'm not saying good romance stories can't be told between two characters who are initially indifferent to, or even actively despise one another, but this is not one of them. After we have this conversation with Rinoa where Squall scoffs at his friend's efforts to hook the two of them up, we go through one dungeon. Rinoa gets put into a comatose state, and then suddenly Squall can't think of anything except getting Rinoa to wake up. One moment, Squall is indifferent to Rinoa to the point of being willing to let Rinoa die without even trying to save her, and is rolling his eyes at his friend's attempts to get them to hook up. Literally 1 hour later in universe, he refuses to leave her side and is constantly thinking about how he can help her, even going as far as to take her comatose body into outer fucking space in search of a cure. What the hell? It's the exact same problem I mentioned last time about Barrett's character arc. He just randomly and arbitrarily switches his tune without us, the audience, getting to see how he actually came to that conclusion. The character arc happens almost entirely off screen. Except in this case, it's far worse because these are the two main characters and their romance is supposed to be the focus. Overall, this game got really lazy with its characters. Most of them have no character development whatsoever, and the only real character arc this game does focus on just feels contrived and completely lacking in chemistry. Well, I've got bad news for the fans of this game. This story also falls flat on its face. To tell you why, let's move on to... Hey, if you made it this far into this video, you obviously must be enjoying the video, so why not show how much you enjoy my content by supporting me on Patreon, or by becoming a channel member for as little as $1 a month. Donate at least $5 a month and I will accept requests for video topics from you. Donate at least $20 a month and you have the right to directly assign me topics and be guaranteed to have your suggestions covered, subject to reasonable terms, of course. Click the Join button below this video to become a channel member, or go to patreon.com/acerthorn to support the channel there. But even if you can't afford to donate even so much as $1 a month, there are still a few ways you can support the channel for free, which I describe in my 20-minute video, How You Can Support the Channel Without Donating. Check out that video for ideas on how you can help the channel grow without spending money. Either way, I hope you decide to support the channel in more ways than just watching this one video. Alright, recommencing the video you all came to see in 3, 2, 1. You start the game as a student at some mercenary college and you're getting ready to take your final exam and actually get your merc license. What's weird about this initial setup is that, although they're teaching you how to be a mercenary for hire, this place is actually set up more like a traditional college or boarding school rather than a boot camp. Sid, the guy in charge of this whole thing, is called the headmaster rather than the commander or whatnot, and he even dresses like a typical high school principal. The student body regularly go off to some secluded location where they can break curfew, and the classrooms look like traditional high school classrooms, with the Japanese design choice of having the rows in the back be elevated and up a staircase. Now, we eventually get to what I think is supposed to be an explanation for why this paramilitary organization is physically structured like a regular university or boarding school. Because that's what it was originally supposed to be, but the cost of constructing the building just went through the roof, and so Sid decided to hire out his students into the merc-for-hire business in order to raise money for its construction. However, I have several problems with that scene, which I'll get to when I discuss that portion of the story that makes me question its legitimacy. But even barring that, that still doesn't explain why the building, even to this day, continues to look and function like a regular boarding school. Nor does it explain why they continue to work in the mercenary business long after the building got constructed. At first, I thought that was just going to be the theme of this game, mixing the exceptional with the banal. Kind of like Dragon Ball, whose primary sense of humor is taking ideas that are completely ludicrous if you say them out loud, and then portraying them in a serious context. In a tournament to decide the strongest martial artist in the world, finalists in this tournament include a smelly German-fisted man who uses his stench to fight with, and a slim and sexy supermodel who weaponizes various aspects of her femininity in order to get a cheap shot in against her unsuspecting male opponent. Later in the story, an evil demon king named Piccolo is freaking out over an electronic rice cooker, and a pink one at that. Even later down the line, the main villain is an androgynous alien who wears lipstick but no pants. However, what makes all of this work is that despite all of the stuff I just described being completely ludicrous, the characters in the story all play it completely straight. That tournament I just described was treated in-universe as an honorable, historic, and revered tournament with rituals and traditions attached to it. King Piccolo was portrayed as an evil demon who brought humanity to the brink of extinction just for his own personal amusement. Pantsless Lipstick Guy was treated by all parties involved as the most feared tyrant in the universe. That's what I thought was going to be the style or theme for this game, mixing the absurd with the banal, while treating the absurd with 100% seriousness. But no, the Seed organization and their 3 gardens are the only part of this game with such a discrepancy. It's almost like the idea for Seed and the 3 gardens was originally supposed to be part of a completely different game that got scrapped, and this part got taken from that scrapped project and put into this game without any regard as to how it matches up with the rest of the game. Actually, as we'll soon see, that's one of the biggest problems with this game's story overall. It feels like 6 or 7 different ideas were taken from their original projects and just stitched together with very little connective tissue, resulting in a finished product that feels more like a collection of parts than one fluid, cohesive whole. Case in point, when we take our Seed exam, we enter soil owned by the country of Galbadia. We are tasked with committing an act of war against the Galbadian government by destroying a communications tower they're trying to repair. Somehow, this doesn't make us an enemy of the state in Galbadia. Don't ask me how that works. After we pass our exam and become full-fledged Seed mercs, we receive our first main assignment: head to the city of Timber and assist the resistance movement, known as the Timber Owls, in driving the Galbadian government out of their city. We eventually find that we are to remain under the employ of the Timber Owls until Timber achieves independence. All of this seems to suggest that the war for Timber independence is going to be the main plot of this game. After all, why have us under contract indefinitely otherwise? When we capture the president of Galbadia using the aforementioned minigame, where I enter the combination to unlock the cars, it's revealed to be a fake president. The Galbadian Empire knew what the Timber Owls were planning and were prepared for it. So clearly this is a powerful and well-funded enemy with a strong intelligence network at its disposal. This certainly raises the stakes and makes the Galbadian Empire out to be quite a formidable adversary. However, after about 4 hours of gameplay, all of that gets swept under the rug. The Galbadian president announces that he is forming a political alliance with someone called the Sorceress, later revealed to be named Edea. The minute the Sorceress appears on camera, she casts the president aside and declares herself the sole ruler of Galbadia. We then hear from someone that the Galbadian president has actually been killed off screen. The game spends all this time setting up a status quo, only to completely scrap all of that and switch gears completely. Honestly, why did we need all of this? If all that was necessary was for Edea to be established as the main villain, there is too much setup for such a story. The game inundates us with comm towers, tyrannical governments, powerful intelligence networks to help build up the threat of this tyrannical government, freedom fighters, all of which have absolutely no relevance to the story beyond this point. We never returned to Timber after this. The fact that we were under contract indefinitely never gets brought up again. The Galbadian government is never mentioned again, and we certainly never do anything to liberate Timber from the Galbadian Empire. Remember in Final Fantasy IV, when I heavily criticized how that game felt compelled to swap out main villains for no good reason? Well, this game has a similar problem. In addition to swapping out main villains, it also swaps out perfectly serviceable main plots for no good reason. So now our mission is to assassinate Edea. However, the reason Edea is targeted for assassination isn't because she's ruling Galbadia now, and so it's part of our mission to liberate Timber. No, the reason we're assassinating Edea now is because, well, actually the game can't really seem to make up its mind about why we're supposed to kill Edea. At first, the headmaster of the Galbadian Garden says that it's because Edea wants to use that garden as her base of operations, suggesting that she's planning on overtaking the garden and killing all of its inhabitants, so we're supposed to just get her before she gets us. But then, all of a sudden it changes so that the whole reason Seed was founded in the first place was for the express purpose of killing Edea, and that every mission up to that point was just building up to this moment. Much like the plot itself, the game can't seem to make up its mind on this. Also, it sure is convenient that Edea, who is our end game, ended up ruling Galbadia, which we just happened to have entered into an indefinite contract to fight against. That's awfully convenient. That sounds like it could have resulted in some serious conflicts of interest, but now the two contracts are one and the same. That is very, very plot convenient. It's almost like Sid somehow knew this was gonna happen. So anyway, we attempt to assassinate Edea, we fail at this, and we wake up in some prison in the middle of nowhere. Squall gets taken to some torture room where he is... oh my god. Hanged in the crucifix position while he's interrogated. Okay, this is obviously going to be a sensitive topic, so let me just get this out of the way. I find this moment to be religiously offensive. In the past, Final Fantasy games have borrowed from the Judeo-Christian faiths, and I have not been offended by it. In Final Fantasy IV, they had a dungeon called the Tower of Babel, which was ripped from Genesis 11, 1 through 9, and Final Fantasy VII made frequent references to a place called the Promised Land, whose name is pulled from the books of Genesis through Judges. I was okay with those two references, but I'm putting my foot down here. Why? Because those two references were in name only, whereas this one is not. Think about it this way. If a parent has a baby boy and names that boy Isaac or Jacob, in the modern era, we do not assume that this name means anything. Both of these names are from the Bible. Isaac is Hebrew for laughter, while Jacob is Hebrew for grasping the heel, because that's how Jacob was born, clinging to the ankle of his fraternal twin brother Esau. However, if someone in the present were named either Isaac or Jacob, we wouldn't assume that they were named after laughter or ankle grabbing, nor would we assume that their parents chose these names for any religious reasons. We would assume that those parents chose those names because they just like the sound of those names. With the Tower of Babel and the Promised Land in the Final Fantasy games, they are likewise in name only. It's literally just the names that were borrowed, none of the actual religious symbolism. But I cannot say the same thing with Squall being hung in the crucifix position. Here, there is some actual attempt at symbolism, and symbolism that is reasonably related to its original religious purpose. Now, that alone isn't enough to offend me. If you can use symbolism from my faith in a tasteful manner, I say go nuts. The problem is that Katase appears to be copying only the superficial aspects of this religious symbolism without considering the substance or context that usually accompany these superficial aspects. While Squall is being hung in the crucifix position, he is being interrogated by Cypher, who is now a bad guy, about the true purpose of Seed. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, the true purpose of Seed is to kill Idia. However, Squall does not give Cypher that information. So, this scene is clearly attempting to portray Squall as a martyr who is protecting Seed's secrets with his life. The problem is that Squall isn't actually a martyr. He doesn't know yet what Seed's true purpose is. He eventually asks Sid about it and Sid tells him, but that's not until after Squall and the gang escape from the prison. So at the time he is being questioned, he really doesn't know the answer. Why does this make it religiously offensive? Because in the actual Bible story, Jesus was fully capable of ending his suffering. He could very easily have used his divine power to get himself off the cross. His hecklers even encourage him to do so, but he chooses to stay on the cross because that's his mission. Squall, meanwhile, cannot just give Cypher this information because he doesn't even have the information to give. Squall isn't choosing to protect Seed's secrets. He isn't murdering himself. He's just being tortured. So the use of the crucifix imagery in this scene is completely wasted. Compounding the problem is that when Jesus was crucified, nobody came to his rescue. His apostles had turned their backs on him because they believed if he was captured and crucified by the Roman Empire, he must not be the Messiah of prophecy after all. Sure, they eventually changed their tune and realized that it was they, not Jesus, who were misunderstanding the prophecy, but that isn't until long after Jesus had died on the cross. Squall is not by himself. His friends are constantly fighting through the prison and are constantly working tirelessly to rescue him, which they eventually do. So Squall isn't being a martyr and he isn't being betrayed by anyone. Well, except maybe Cypher, but he was a dick from the start. So the crucifix symbolism here falls completely flat. Now, some of you might reasonably ask, why is it such a big deal that they get the religious symbolism just slightly off? Why are you so butthurt about that? Well, to help you understand, let's use an example of a religious symbol whose corresponding religion is much more prominent in Japan than Christianity, the swastika. As many of you are by now no doubt aware, the swastika was not always a symbol of anti-Semitism. That's its primary meaning here in the West, but it was originally meant to symbolize the eternal cycle, of which reincarnation, the Buddhist doctrine that is most well known outside of Buddhist circles, is certainly a part of that cycle. So when I see the swastika in a game like the original NES Legend of Zelda, which was made by a Japanese Buddhist, I am far less likely to be offended by that symbol's presence than, say, if I see it tattooed on the arm of some white guy in the United States. Well, if I'm going to give inward privilege to East Asian Buddhists to use the swastika without simultaneously giving that same privilege to other faiths and other nationalities, I think it's only fair to expect other people to treat my religion and its symbolism with a similar amount of respect. And for the record, I'm not even asking Katase not to use Christian symbolism in his games. But if he's going to do that, he should actually research the symbolism and make sure he gets it right. The way it's presented in this game just feels half-assed, and that's just disrespectful to the largest religion in the world. So anyway, as we escape the prison, we find that some of Seed's gardens are being targeted for a missile strike. So we split the group up so that Squad A heads over to the missile base to try and abort the missile, while Squad B returns to Balam Garden and warns Sid of the impending attack, just in case Squad A is unsuccessful in stopping the missile launch. When we get back to Balam Garden, Sid tells us about a rumor he's heard about this place, how there's some elaborate defense system hidden in the garden's basement. We go to the basement and indeed activate the garden's mobility, allowing us to get out of range of the missile strikes. However, we then talk to Sid, and this is where we get the exposition that Seed was created in the first place for the sole purpose of funding construction of Balam Garden. I mean, the sole purpose of killing Edea, even though the order to assassinate her was originally just to get her before she gets us, and brain freeze! However, Sid also states that he's the one who ordered this building's construction. This begs the question of how he doesn't already know that the garden is mobile. Instead, he only speaks of it like a rumor he heard from his predecessor or something. If he was the one who designed this building in the first place, he should already know damn well that it can move. Anyway, he also tells us that Edea is actually his wife, just throwing that out there since it does become important later on. Anyway, as we are drifting along, we eventually crash into a town called Fisherman's Horizon, because they're supported by a fishing industry. Ha! Actually, naming conventions aside, this is one of the few points in the game where I actually like the story. They have a strict law against violence of any kind, and for that reason, they don't trust Seed, an organization whose entire purpose is violence. The mayor believes that any dispute can be resolved through peaceful discussion. Most of us probably instantly see a flaw in this philosophy. And indeed, when Edea's forces attack, looking for Elune, the mayor tries to reason with them. The soldiers decide to burn the city to the ground. We later deduce that this is to give Elune fewer places to hide, and the mayor's pleas fall on deaf ears. So we do the only thing we can do in good conscience. We save him. After the battle, Squall explains to the mayor what the majority of us were already thinking. The whole talk through your problems philosophy is great in principle, but it really requires the cooperation of both parties in order to work. Some people just aren't willing to talk it out. With them, violence really is the only answer. Well, that was a nice subplot. Well, back to shit. So some stuff happens in the game, nothing truly important. The most interesting thing is that Squall gets appointed commander of Seed, and eventually Selphie asks to visit Trabia Garden. Why? Because it's the garden where she was trained, and it's where she has all her memories. However, as I mentioned earlier, there was a missile strike headed for that garden that the heroes weren't able to abort, so she wants to check up on all her friends and see if they're okay. Now, this sounds like a great opportunity for Selphie to get some much-needed character development. But nope, the game does fuck all with this detour. When we get there, we find that the missiles made a direct hit, and the survivors are doing their best to rebuild while also trying their best to keep each other from mentally falling to pieces. However, as far as Selphie is concerned, the game does practically nothing with her. There's some bog standard shots of her mourning the dead and reacting to the destruction, but she never develops in any way. There's characterization in this game, but it actually goes to Rinoa. This is the section where we get Rinoa's aforementioned characterization that she doesn't like fighting, and it honestly just comes out of nowhere. It would have made so much more sense if she said this while we were at Fisherman's Horizon. That was a section of the game where pacifism and how violence was occasionally necessary was the central theme. So why couldn't we have gotten that characterization about her there instead? Then it would have been thematically appropriate. But as it stands, not only does Rinoa's dialogue come completely out of nowhere, but she ends up yanking the spotlight away from Selphie in the one section of the game where Selphie should have gotten to take center stage. So right after Rinoa hogs the spotlight from Selphie, Irving tells us that everyone in this group, except Rinoa, actually grew up together in the same orphanage, and it was actually Edea who looked after the kids when they were at the orphanage. So why don't any of the other people remember their childhood together? Well, as it turns out, because all of the other seeds have been junctioning their guardian forces to gain extra power for several years now, that has the side effect of causing them to lose some of their earlier memories. Irving still remembers these things because he only just recently started junctioning the GFs, so they haven't had time to make him forget things. This, honestly, had the potential to be a very interesting piece of world building and lore. Remember earlier when I said there was potentially another reason Irving was nervous about firing the shot? Well, this is it. If he remembers all this stuff from their pasts, he obviously would recognize Edea as the woman who brought him up. As such, it would make perfect sense that he would get cold feet about shooting the woman who raised him even if she was doing horrible deeds. However, while this idea was full of dramatic and narrative potential, it is just that. All potential and no capitalization. The problem with all of this is that the game never really does anything with these two ideas. This is the only time the memory loss is brought up as a side effect of junctioning, and it really only seems to be in the story in order to explain how all the main characters except Rinoa could have grown up together in the same orphanage without remembering it. However, that backstory doesn't need to be in the story in the first place. Them growing up together honestly serves no purpose to the story. In Final Fantasy III, the fact that all four main characters were orphans was used as a sign that they were indeed the chosen warriors of prophecy. It's not a narrative purpose I like, for reasons I go into in my retrospective of that game, but at least it serves some kind of purpose. But here, the fact that 5 of the 6 main characters all grew up in the same orphanage doesn't seem to serve any purpose in the story. So why put it in there? In addition to being completely pointless, it also opens the floodgates for a wide variety of untapped potential for Irving's character. Because Irving is the only one of the group who still remembers his childhood, he could have served as a mentor of sorts. Sid and later Edea serve as a mentor while briefing the heroes on their mission, but Irving could have served as a mentor on the field, telling the other characters about things they used to do that would be useful to their current predicament if they did them here. But no, despite Irving being in a unique position regarding his memories, the story does absolutely nada with that idea. Well, now that we know about our backstory, we decide to head over to the orphanage, where we all grew up, to see if we can find any clues about what to do next. Now this actually feels somewhat organic. It's completely contrived that Irving would wait until now to tell us about our backstory when he's known all along, but now that we know about it, it makes perfect sense that we would want to return to that place to see if we can learn anything. Unfortunately, the game fucks even this up, because when you get to Edea's house, we can't go inside for whatever reason. Jesus fucking Christ, Katase, can't you have just 2 moments in a row where things make sense? This entire game so far has had moment after moment where the game does not tell the player what to do, requiring the player to do completely random and arbitrary stuff to move the plot forward, or having the plot move forward for us by having the characters do entirely random things without any input from the player. Here, we finally got the idea to do something that actually makes sense, but we can't have 2 sensible moments in a row? if the characters decide to go to Edia's house to look for clues, then you should let me go to Edia's house to look for clues. This is not rocket science. Instead, you know how we move the plot forward? Well, it turns out that Edia has gained control of the Golbadian Garden and is using it as her base, just like the Golbadian headmaster said she would. Not only that, but they also seem to have figured out how to activate their garden's mobility, just like us, so they are parked right outside Edia's house. To move the plot forward, we drive up next to them and initiate a battle. It's almost like they were waiting for us, which would be ridiculous because they had no way of knowing we were planning on coming here. Not unless they looked at the game's script and saw where we reached the decision to come here. Honestly, at this point, I wouldn't put it past Katase to use that as the actual in-game excuse for how they were waiting for us here. Like in the movie Robin Hood Men in Tights, when Robin literally pulls out his copy of the script and notices that he gets another shot. Except that joke actually worked, because Robin Hood Men in Tights was a comedy film. Not just any comedy, but a farce. Farce films can get away with just about anything, because absurdity is what they're about. But here, we are given no indication that this game's story isn't meant to be taken seriously. Rather, we are given every indication that, with the exception of the occasional comic relief, like the kid in the house who tries to charge us to look out the window, we are supposed to take the story seriously for the most part. So, how did the Golbadian Garden know where we were going to be? The game never tells us. So we storm the Golbadian Garden, we have round 2 with Edia, again we fail to kill her, and this time Rinoa goes into that magical coma I mentioned when I was discussing the Squall-Rinoa romance. However, Edia also seems genuinely concerned for her actions and wonders out loud if she successfully protected Elune. We eventually learn that this is because Edia wasn't the main villain after all. Edia still loves the orphans she raised. Instead, her body was possessed by a sorceress from the future named Ultimecia. Yep, as if it wasn't bad enough that the game swapped out the tyrannical Golbadian government in favor of Edia, Katase feels compelled to swap out main villains again. Well, we are now finally on the main villain that this game will keep for the remainder of its run. However, by this point, it's so late in the game that it's pathetic. Even if we didn't have a main villain swap out earlier in the game, the fact that the swap out is happening at this late a point is baffling. On the original hardware, this game was originally on 4 discs, and the 4th disc was literally just the final dungeon, so it's actually more like 3.1 discs. If I were playing this game on the original hardware, we would have been having this conversation with Edia at the beginning of disc 3. So we are essentially in the last third of the game, and we're suddenly getting a new main villain. It's not as bad as Final Fantasy IV, but that's not a high bar to clear. In that game, Zemos was swapped out for Zeromus literally right before the final boss fight. I literally can't imagine how you even could swap out main villains at any later point. So you'll forgive me if I say that the mere fact that this game's swapping out of main villains isn't the worst in the entire franchise doesn't impress me all that much. Anyway, Edia tells us that Ultimecia's end goal is to do something known as time compression. What exactly that entails and why it's something we want to stop her from doing is never explained in the game. Does time compression mean that time will move faster so that if someone is on the outside looking in, it will appear as if everything is moving in fast forward? If so, why do the characters care if that happens? They're inside the flow of time, so they shouldn't notice anything unusual. It should be like if I use the in-game booster to have everything move at 3 times the normal speed. For me, that means I can plow through the game faster and get this retrospective video out for you guys quicker than I normally would. But the characters in-universe still behave as if the game is being played at normal speed, because from their point of view, it is. As it stands, saying that Ultimecia wants to undergo time compression is like telling us that she wants to perform the ritual of Balagalaka. But then neither the characters in the game nor the game itself actually bothers to tell us what exactly the ritual of Balagalaka entails, or what happens when the ritual of Balagalaka is performed. Instead, the characters all panic and are determined to prevent the ritual of Balagalaka at any costs, even though we, the audience, have no idea what the stakes are. Now, that's not to say that villains with ill-defined motives can't work, but there needs to be at least some foundation upon which the protagonist can reasonably assume the villain's intentions are malevolent. For example, in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, the audience doesn't know until the very end exactly what Voldemort wants inside the Department of Mysteries. However, Harry and the audience alike also don't really need to know all the details. We know enough about Voldemort to know that whatever he wants, it'll be bad news if he gets it. That alone is enough of a motive for Harry to keep the prophecy from the Death Eaters at all costs. However, that only works because we've spent the past 5 books building up Voldemort as irredeemably evil. It's only because of what we already know about Voldemort as a person that we don't need his entire motive to be spelled out for us at the beginning. For a villain like Ultimecia, who has literally just been introduced into the story, and even then introduced in name only, it won't be until right before the final boss fight that we actually meet her, the best way to establish her as a threat is to give her a goal where it is immediately apparent why we want to stop her. So the heroes decide to seek out Elone, both because Elone's powers to send people into the past through the eyes of other people is instrumental to Ultimecia's carrying out her wish to do time compression, somehow, but also because Squall somehow thinks that Elone can help Rinoa wake up from her coma. Oh, by the way, Squall now all of a sudden decides he actually cares for Rinoa. That came out of left field. Anyway, we do some detective work and find that Elone is in Esthar, so we head over to the city of Esthar and we find that she isn't even in Esthar anymore, but instead out in space, on some space that's situated next to the moon. What the fuck Elone is doing in outer space is never explained. When we meet her, she surely isn't doing anything, she's just hanging out in her bedroom, so why couldn't she just be hanging out in her bedroom in Esthar? Why does she need to be in space? Well, I think I know why, but it's really contrived. Yeah, something about this game being contrived, imagine that, and I'll get to that in a little bit. While we're on the lunar base, we learn that the moon is itself home to indigenous life. Once in a while, these life forms, which are monsters by Earth standards, like to congregate in one spot, forming a sort of circle that causes the moon to look like a giant eyeball. When enough of them congregate, they all tend to float down to Earth in a manner that looks like a giant teardrop when viewed from afar. This event is known as the Lunar Cry. It happened approximately 100 years ago, and that resulted in one city being completely wiped off the map. However, it is never explained why the lunar monsters didn't extend their destruction beyond the one city where they just happened to all land. Were they unable to survive for more than a few days in Earth's atmosphere? Did some brave legendary warriors drive the lunar monsters back before they could destroy more than one city? We never get the full backstory. Well, the Lunar Cry eventually happens right as we are getting ready to head back to Earth. However, rather than attacking an Earthbound city, they instead congregate around some giant flying skyscraper called the Lunatic Pandora. However, since Ultimecia's time compression happens immediately after this, and we then move on to the final dungeon immediately after that, that means that the immediate aftermath of the Lunar Cry and the sudden swarm of lunar monsters attacking Earth never gets explored. I honestly have a love-hate relationship with Katase's decision not to explore this. On the one hand, if he wasn't going to deliver the goods, why did he even bother introducing it? The Lunatic Pandora honestly seems like a perfectly serviceable penultimate dungeon, even without the lunar monsters swarming around it like an angry hornet's nest, so why even bother? On the other hand, if Katase were to fully explore the aftermath of the Lunar Cry, all that would have done is just add yet another subplot onto a story that already had too many. Yeah, I've been mostly glossing over them, but this game just has way too many subplots. I mentioned earlier in this video that the entire game feels like about a half a dozen different game ideas that were all scrapped, but then parts of them were stitched together to make this game, and the part where this Frankenstein's monster of a game design appears at its most Frankenstein-y is with its numerous subplots. I already mentioned the subplots of the protagonists being orphans together and how the GF junctioning makes you forget things. Both of those subplots ultimately go absolutely nowhere. I also mentioned how the timber resistance movement is initially set up to be the game's main plot, only to get dropped like a bad habit without any kind of resolution. However, that's only the tip of the iceberg with this game and its subplots. Quistis starts the game as our instructor at Balam Garden, but after we graduate and become a full Seed member, she gets relieved of her teaching duties and is demoted to being a regular Seed soldier. At one point, she lays her hang-ups on Squall, mentioning how depressed she is that she got fired. But after that one conversation, this subplot is never brought up again. The Laguna, Kios, and Ward subplot gets brought up multiple times during the game, but it ultimately goes nowhere. There are plenty of sequences that feel like they could have been cut without consequence to the story, what little there is. For example, was it really so crucial to the main plot that we saw the chapter in Laguna's life where he takes up acting in movies because he's desperate for cash? Why is that necessary that we see that? For that matter, we never really find out exactly what Elone was trying to learn about Laguna by sending Squall into Laguna's mind. So this entire subplot ends up being entirely pointless, seeing as we, never find out what the point of it was. We head to Trabia Garden and find the survivors there trying to rebuild, and then we just leave them to their rebuilding. It gave Selphie a moment to mourn, but not to have any character development, so it was ultimately a superfluous detour. The Fisherman Horizon subplot about pacifism is enjoyable while it lasts, but it's so brief that it's like being served a single morsel of a juicy steak. Meanwhile, the Garden Festival gets talked about from time to time, and it sort of gets a resolution. I mean, Selphie does rope the others into performing just so she can technically say the festival happened, sort of, I guess. Ultimately, what Katase should have done was have fewer subplots. He should have just picked an A plot and a B plot and stuck to it. If he was going to have subplots, each one of them needed to have a clear beginning, middle, and end. And most importantly of all, they had to serve a purpose. And no, simply padding out the game so that it takes an arbitrary number of hours to complete does not count as serving a purpose. Examples of valid purposes that subplots can serve include, but are not limited to, giving character development to some of the side characters, giving backstory to help us better understand what the main conflict is, and providing us with interesting and fun side activities or mini-games we can do. For the many subplots in this game, most of them are left unresolved and nearly all of them fail to serve any legitimate purpose whatsoever. So anyway, just as Squall convinces Elone to help with Rinoa, Rinoa actually wakes up, except she isn't all better now. Instead, she starts walking like a zombie. Somehow, the lunar base's alarm system goes off, even though the only abnormal thing happening at the moment is Rinoa acting like a zombie, which doesn't seem like something the lunar base would be programmed to detect. Anyway, Rinoa enters the control room and activates one of the release valves to release the sorceress Adele from her prison. Oh yeah, that's another subplot in this that has subplots packed into it like sardines. Basically, Adele was a sorceress who ruled over Esthar just a mere 17 years before the events of this game. She was basically this planet's version of Hitler, leaving a trail of death and destruction in her wake. She was eventually usurped and trapped in a space pod where she remains imprisoned as of the events of this game. Well, Rinoa is possessed by something and is being forced to release Adele from her prison. Okay, first of all, why would you want to keep Adele inside Earth orbit? Once you've got her trapped in her little space pod, why not just jettison that pod into space to drift for eternity until she dies of oxygen deprivation? Are you seriously going to tell me that, for this game's equivalent to Hitler, the government of Esthar is worried about humane punishment and not believing in the death penalty? Give me a fucking break. But even barring that, assuming for the sake of argument that there's an absolute prohibition on the death penalty in all cases whatsoever, I still have to ask, why the fuck would you, while constructing Adele's prison, go to the trouble of installing a release mechanism? Even if she can't be sentenced to death for whatever reason, surely she's been sentenced to life in prison. In what circumstance would anyone want to release her? This is yet another reason why I believe the lunar base was completely unnecessary from a game design standpoint, and it would have made so much more sense to just have Elone hiding out in regular Esthar. If we didn't go to outer space in this game, we could very easily assume that the people of this planet simply don't have space travel technology at their disposal. Thus, when Adele was captured, they may have contemplated the death penalty, but they couldn't just jettison her into space to drift for eternity. Instead, they had to find a way to kill her directly, and they may not have been able to find a way to do that. So they instead resolved to hold her in a prison cell, not in the name of humane treatment, but simply because it was all they could do given the technology they had at their disposal. So, not only would Adele's prison have been a lot more forgivable, but it also would have saved us the subplot about the lunar cry, which was just never going to get explored anyway. So when Rinoa releases Adele, her body is then jettisoned off into space to die, having served whatever purpose her possessor wanted. This means that Squall has to go out into space to rescue her, using that aforementioned minigame about keeping Rinoa in his crosshairs. When that happens, they somehow gravitate back to a portion of the lunar base known as the Ragnarok. How? If it was gravity that was pulling them towards it, why didn't the gravity just pull Rinoa towards it when she was by herself? Is it because of double the mass causing double the gravity? If it was, Katase apparently doesn't know how gravity works. An object, or in this case a pair of objects, that is twice the size of another object will indeed have twice the force of gravity pulling on it by some other celestial body, but it will also have twice the mass. These two things exactly cancel each other, and so the acceleration due to gravity is the same in all cases. So just because it's two bodies instead of one should not have had any effect on whether they gravitate towards the Ragnarok or continue to drift off into oblivion. Once we complete the Ragnarok dungeon, we then have the Ragnarok as an airship back on Earth. Remember earlier I mentioned that there was a really contrived reason why I suspected the lunar base subplot was in the game, when it would have made just as much sense to have a alone hiding out in regular-ass Esthar? Well, this is it. It seems like it was designed simply as a conceit to introduce the airship in a way that was technically different from the past 7 games. What makes this stupid is, well, why do we even need an airship at all? In the Final Fantasy VII Retrospective, I mentioned how I was ready for a change in the status quo for this series and how I was disappointed when the game ended up falling back on the same gameplay formula as the earlier games. Well, here, the need to stick to formula caused Katase to introduce a completely unnecessary outer space section into the game that ultimately did more harm than good to the story for reasons I've already described, all in the name of coming up with a new way of introducing the airship. Well, why do we need an airship? Because this is a Final Fantasy game and so it has to have an airship. Says who? The airship is introduced so late in the game anyway that it hardly even matters, so why even bother? Why not just have a game without an airship? Remember that the canoe was also part of the Final Fantasy formula for the first 3 games. It got phased out significantly in Final Fantasy III. In fact, I think it was only ever used once in that entire game, before being phased out entirely from Final Fantasy IV onwards, and nobody seemed to care that the canoe was missing. So there is certainly some precedent to suggest that fans wouldn't throw a hissy fit if there was a game without an airship if it meant the story would flow better as a result. So anyway, as we're making our way back to Earth, it is revealed that Rinoa is now a sorceress. Apparently, in our last confrontation with Edea, when Rinoa was thrown into the coma, Edea had transferred her sorceress powers to Rinoa, so that Ultimecia could no longer possess her. But that also enabled Ultimecia to possess Rinoa instead, which is apparently what caused Rinoa to release a demo. However, this raises a whole slew of world-building questions that, and say it with me everyone, never get fully explored. First of all, what does it mean to be a sorceress? All the main characters can use magic, so that can't be the main difference. For that matter, under what conditions are you able to transfer your sorceress status in order to no longer be possessed? Did Rinoa get a say in whether she got to be a sorceress? If not, that's kind of a dick move on Edea's part, don't you think? And why don't you just pass your sorceress status onto some organism that can't do any harm even if Ultimecia is possessing it, like a blade of grass or something? And why was Rinoa walking like a zombie? Edea never walked like a zombie when she was possessed. Anyway, we finally get to meet the elusive president of Esthar, and it turns out to be Laguna. He got elected to president because he captured a Dell 17 years ago. Now, since I've alienated 99% of this game's fans by this point anyway, I feel no fear saying that I consider this plot point to be rather underwhelming. The president of Esthar could have been literally anybody. His only contribution to the plot at this point is coming up with the plan to defeat Ultimecia, an idea that could have, and probably should have, been devised by Cid and Edea, since they're the ones who have been guiding us through this game up until this point. Rather, it seems that Laguna being the president of Esthar was just thrown in at the last minute in order to give some sort of payoff to all those trippy dream sequences, those sequences that totally didn't need to be in the game in the first place. Anyway, Laguna's plan to defeat Ultimecia is to allow Ultimecia to at least partially complete her plan of engaging in time compression. When that happens, the fact that she exists in the future won't matter, because future and present will be one and the same. Because we will exist alongside Ultimisia, we will be able to just walk right up to her and kick her ass. No explanation as to how we're supposed to uncompress time after we defeat Ultimisia though. I guess the characters are supposed to just figure that out off screen at some later point. Now, as I've hopefully made clear in this video, a huge chunk of the game relies on the plot moving forward because of characters doing things that make no sense. For example, the president of Galbadia enters into an alliance with the sorceress despite the sorceress having done absolutely nothing to deserve that level of trust. Regarding Ultimisia's goal of time compression, not only is it entirely vague what exactly that would entail, but we never get any explanation as to why she even wants to do that in the first place. When we're trying to abort the missile aimed for Balam Garden, one of the guards at the missile base just randomly decides to let us use his login credentials so we can abort the missile even though we're the enemy. The Galbadian Garden meets us for a civil war battle because it just happens to know where we're going to be. Adel is imprisoned within Earth orbit rather than simply jettisoned off into space for no reason other than pure plot convenience. The list goes on and on. Well, at the conclusion of the penultimate dungeon of the game, we get a moment that has to be the most random and arbitrary moment in the entire game. When we face Cypher one last time, we defeat him. Renoa, who previously was in love with Cypher, spends a total of 3 seconds mourning over his body, and then she just wanders the fuck off. What? Why? How? What the fuck are you doing, Renoa? She isn't even possessed at this point because she isn't walking like a zombie. Of course, as soon as Renoa is off camera, Cypher suddenly comes to his senses and runs after Renoa, kidnapping her while Squall just stands there like a doofus and watches. What the hell? So apparently Adel, Renoa, and Elone all have to be in close proximity to each other in order for Ultimisia to perform her time compression ritual. Why? Because why not? This game's story has been making the rules up as it goes along for the entire experience up until now, so why expect it to start making sense now, when we're almost at the end? Also, side note, but if Ultimisia needed Renoa to be next to both Elone and Adel at the same time, why did she allow Renoa to drift off into space after releasing Adel? So we bring these three people together, the time compression happens, and we find ourselves outside of Ultimisia's castle. As we are going through Ultimisia's castle, our Guardian Force attacks, items, spells, and even our ability to save are all disabled. Because this game just couldn't help but add one extra layer of bullshit in the final dungeon of the game. Oh, and just to rub salt in the wound, right before you get to Ultimisia, there is actually a safe spot right outside the door. But of course, you can't use it for anything. You can't save at the save spot because saving is disabled, and you can't use a tent or cottage to heal up either because you can't use items. So this save spot is a complete waste of space. So what's the only proper way to cap off the bullshittiest story in the entire franchise up to this point? By having the bullshittiest boss fight. Oh sure, they don't swap out main villains a third time right before the final boss fight, but they actually pull not one, but two completely cheap moves that make this final boss fight far, far worse than the Final Fantasy IV boss fight. First of all, when we begin the boss fight, for no conceivable reason whatsoever, the game decides to swap out Squall for Zell and force us to fight with Zell instead. What the fuck, game? Zell has no junctions in my playthrough, so he goes down in one hit. I can't even use a Phoenix down to revive him because the second bullshit thing this boss fight throws at you is the fact that your guardian forces, magic, and items are disabled in the final dungeon also applies to the final boss fight. So I can't use GF attacks, I can't use items, nor can I use spells. So the only thing that remains is my regular attacks. I still keep all the stat buffs from my junctions, but all I can do is attack. This means that the final boss fight, which should be the most difficult test of skill the game has to offer, instead has me reduced to simply spamming the A button for 10 minutes. Not because it's the most efficient path to victory, like in the minigame where we fight the dragon, but because it's literally the only thing I can do at all. No skill, no strategy, no strategic use of resources or careful selection of attacks. Just mash the A button like the world's longest quick time event. This final boss fight can go fuck itself with a knife. So we finally defeat Ultimecia. We go through a cutscene that was more trippy than the actual time compression cutscene, and then finally the game cuts to end credits. Good fucking riddance. This is, hands down, the most convoluted, jarbled, incoherentness of a story I have ever seen in a video game, and I cannot be happier to see it end. A while ago, I was chatting with a subscriber in the comments of a community post, and I told him that there was no Final Fantasy game up to this point that I truly hated. This is not an objective scoring system on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is phenomenal and 1 is abysmal. My ranking system ranks these games in comparison to each other. Even Final Fantasy III, which currently occupies the bottom of the list so far, I still found at least moderately enjoyable. However, as many of you might have already guessed, that has now changed. This is the first Final Fantasy game that I truly disliked, from top to bottom. The gameplay is cryptic and requires an online guide at nearly all times. The combat is unnecessarily confusing. The characters are undeveloped to an almost criminal degree, and the story, oh my god, the story is one of the most incoherent Frankenstein's monsters of a story I have ever seen. The story cannot just pick a plot and stick with it to save its life, and it hops around from subplot to subplot like it has a severe case of storytelling ADD. Now top all of that off with the absolute bullshittiest final boss fight I have ever had to sit through, and we get a game that is just a complete mess from front to back. On the bottom half of my list, which so far includes Final Fantasy IV, VI, and III, each of those games did something worse than Final Fantasy VIII. 4 was worse in the way it swapped out main villains for no good reason, although 8 still had an even bullshittier final boss fight overall. 3 was worse in the way it endangered children's lives by conscripting them to go to war, and 6, well, 6 had magic roofie piss. However, for all their flaws, 4, 6, and 3 all still had a lot to like about those games. There is not a lot to like about 8. There's the Fisherman's Horizon subplot, and that's about it. So for all of these reasons and more, it should come as no surprise that I rank Final Fantasy VIII at the bottom of the list so far, below Final Fantasy III. It is just an overall unpleasant experience from cover to cover. Next time, I will do a retrospective analysis of Final Fantasy IX, the only game in the series to be directed solely and entirely by Hiroyuki Ito, the gameplay director for Final Fantasy VI. Like Final Fantasy VIII, I will not be reviewing the original hardware version of this game, but instead the HD remake released in 2016 for Steam on the PC. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed this retrospective, please hit that subscribe button for more videos just like it. Also, if you enjoy my content overall, please consider supporting the channel directly, either with Patreon support or channel memberships. Silver and Gold level members and Patreon supporters are allowed to submit requests for video topics, and Gold members and Patreon supporters are allowed to directly assign me video topics that I am guaranteed to cover. In the meantime, however, I am Acer Thorn, and I will see you guys later. Peace!